Chapter 12. The Global Mirror. Canada is not the exception. Canada is the example. It would be reassuring to believe that what this book describes is a uniquely Canadian problem, a specific failure of specific institutions, a local dysfunction that could be fixed by electing different people or adjusting particular policies, without confronting the broader logic that produced it. It is not. And understanding why it is not matters, both because it changes how we understand our own situation and because it suggests where the sources of real change might need to be found. Canada is not behind the curve on this story. In several dimensions, we are ahead of it. The housing financialization, the retreat of public services, the widening gap between productivity and wages, the consolidation of media ownership, the charitable structures that serve wealth while claiming to serve the public. These patterns are playing out across the English-speaking world and beyond. We can see further down the road than countries still in earlier stages of the same process. What we see should concern us, and what other countries have tried, both what has worked and what has not, should inform us. The English-speaking template. The countries that have traveled furthest down this road share a common policy inheritance. The United Kingdom and Australia offer the clearest mirrors. In the United Kingdom, the pivot began in the 1980s with a policy that was, in the short term, genuinely popular. The Right to Buy scheme, which allowed tenants in public housing to purchase their homes at significant discounts from market value. For the families who bought, it worked as promised. They acquired assets that appreciated over the decades that followed. They built wealth where they had previously only held tenancy. What the policy also did was permanently drain the supply of social housing. The units sold were not replaced. The stock of publicly owned, affordably rented housing built over decades was liquidated in a generation and was never rebuilt at meaningful scale. The long-term consequence was a country that increasingly cannot house the people who operate it. London today is one of the most expensive cities in the world for housing, and among the most unequal in the developed world. The nurses who staff its hospitals, the teachers who staff its schools, the transit workers who move its population, they cannot afford to live in it. They commute from further and further away, spending larger and larger portions of their incomes on transportation to reach jobs that are not paying them enough to close the gap. The city functions because it extracts labor from people it cannot afford to house. That is not a market outcome. That is a policy outcome. Australia offers a different mechanism producing the same result. Through a tax provision called negative gearing, Australian property investors are permitted to deduct the losses on investment properties against their ordinary income. In practice, buying a rental property at a loss, paying more in mortgage, maintenance, and costs than the property generates in rent, generates a tax benefit that offsets what the investor earns elsewhere. The more you lose on an investment property, the less tax you pay on your other income. This provision has survived multiple governments of different political stripes, each of which has declined to remove it because the beneficiaries are a large and politically engaged constituency of existing property owners. The result is a policy that systematically transfers wealth from renters to owners, from younger Australians trying to enter the market to older Australians already positioned within it, from those whose primary income is wages to those whose primary income is investment returns. The subsidy is paid by the public purse. The beneficiaries are the same people whose political resources make them the most effective opponents of its removal. These are not isolated national stories. They are the same pressure running through different instruments, in different jurisdictions, producing the same general result. The returns from economic growth flowing disproportionately to those who hold assets rather than those who perform labor. What the political signal actually means. There is a temptation to read the political turbulence of the last decade in Western democracies as irrational, as the triumph of emotion over reason, of fear over fact, of grievance politics over responsible governance. That reading misses the signal. When communities built around manufacturing employment lose those jobs, not to technological progress that raises everyone's standard of living, but to cost arbitrage that raises returns for shareholders while eliminating wages and benefits for workers. That is not an irrational grievance. The people who feel it are perceiving something real. When a generation that did everything it was told, studied, accumulated credentials, found employment, discovers that the life those efforts were supposed to purchase is structurally unavailable at any wage it can actually earn, that is not a personal failing. It is a structural outcome. The young people who feel cheated are not wrong about being cheated. When a household that has watched its real purchasing power stagnate for 2 decades while asset prices have doubled, is told that the problem is cultural, that the correct response is to work harder, spend less, make better choices. The anger that follows is proportional. It is a reasonable response to a condition that has been accurately diagnosed, even if the proposed remedies are sometimes badly misdirected. The political volatility of recent years is, in significant part, a signal that the decoupling has reached a point where its consequences can no longer be managed with reassurance and patience. People feel correctly that something fundamental has changed. They do not always have precise vocabulary for naming what changed or where the pressure came from, but the underlying perception that the system no longer works for them the way it once did, that the rules favor those who already have, that the promises made to their generation have not been kept, is accurate. These comparisons do not point to perfection elsewhere. Every country has its failures, but they demonstrate something essential. The trajectory of the last 50 years is not an iron law. It is a choice made differently in different places with different results. The decoupling was chosen. It can be unchosen. The window for choosing differently. There is a feature of this pattern worth naming directly. The window for course correction is not permanently open. Political systems that allow structural inequality to compound for long enough eventually reach a point where the constituencies most damaged by that inequality are also the constituencies with the least political power. They are financially stressed, time-poor, less organized, more easily divided. The structural advantages that have compounded over decades continue to compound. The resources available to protect those advantages from democratic challenge continue to grow. The window narrows. Canada is not yet at that point, but the direction is visible, and the pace is not slowing. The same clarity that Carney invoked about geopolitical power, that assuming the old rules still protect you when they manifestly do not, is a form of dangerous naivety, applies here. Pretending that the drift will correct itself, that the institutions will right themselves without pressure, that patience is the appropriate response to a problem that has been compounding for 50 years. That is not optimism. It is accommodation. We can continue to perform the social contract. We can keep the sign in the window. We can tell ourselves that the system is basically fair, that the outcomes reflect individual choices, that the right response to structural inequality is personal virtue. Or we can take down the sign. The global mirror shows us what taking it down requires. It requires naming the pattern clearly, not in anger, but in honesty. It requires recognizing that what has been done by policy can be undone by policy. It requires building the political will to make different choices about how productivity gains are shared, about how housing is treated, about who shapes the rules and in whose interest they are shaped. Other countries have done parts of this better. None have done all of it perfectly. But the evidence that things can be different is not hypothetical. It exists. And it begins, as Havel always insisted, with the simple act of refusing to perform what everyone can already see. The greengrocer removes the sign. The mirror shows us we are not alone in needing to do it.